Anyone need another copy of this? Okay, remind me, I believe we did these two on this page. That's okay, great. So then we're gonna keep going. So let's focus. For number 3, we're talking about shifted up, shifted down, steep or less steep. If it's shifted up or down, what is it talking about? The y-intercept or the slope? The y-intercept. Comparing the original to this, if it shifts down, how do we know that? Because of the -4. And then the next one is talking about the slope. And it's less steep, why? It's a fraction less than 1. Okay. Number 4. It has a graph. This graph is g of x, your new function. F of x is not drawn on there, but if you want to draw it on there, you can. I'm going to draw it just so we all original and compare. So we are comparing the slope of the new function, the one that's already on there, to the original. What changed? Which of these apply? Which of these one? And this one's talking about the slope. B. It can't be adding or subtracting, because that's y-intercept. So it has to be adding, multiplying or dividing. And if we look at the slope of this new function, it's going up 2 to the right 3, so it is 2/3 times 1. But the y-intercept of the new function compared to the old one is what? Which of these applies? It's 3 less than, and we found 3. Can't be multiplying or dividing. Has to be adding or subtracting. Do you have questions on either of those? -3, yes. Right, and then for number 5, we need to plot 2 points where it shifted up 5 units and half as steep. So if it shifted up 5 units, where's our new y-intercept? On the y-intercept, on the y-axis. And then what would our slope be? 1/2. So you just need 2 points. Decide on which direction you want to go, up and to the right, down and to the left. Doesn't matter. You just need 2 points. Do not make a line. And that is it. If you didn't want the 2 points next to each other, you could have done up to the right 2 a couple times. Doesn't matter. Questions on that one? To the next page. So this page is going to be a mixture of graphing and describing. We're going to mix that up. So on this first one, I'm gonna draw in the original y equals x. You can do this, you don't have to do this. If you want rulers, you're free to grab those. No. This is the original. So these first couple, we're going to graph the new function and then describe, and then we're going to describe and then graph for some of them. So for this one, if I were to graph it, it has a y-intercept at -5, slope of 6, so I could go up 6, to the right 1. If I did it again, I'd be off the graph, but that's okay. Something like that. So if we're comparing this one we just drew to the original, what changed? Okay, what about it? The y-intercept went down, not up. So we could say the y-intercept shifted down 5. What else? What is steeper? The slope is steeper by how much? 6. Or you can say the slope is 6 times as steep. Either or. Did this one reflect? No, it's not a negative. Okay, I'm going to draw in the next one, which happens to be our original.
That's also original.
So if this looks the same as the original, did anything change? No, so you would just say that the slope and the y-intercept stayed the same. If it's you won't get a question like this, but if it was a question with a graph, you would graph the new function. You don't have to graph the original and then write in the description. It would say, so like this one says, sketch the graph and describe. Great, we're gonna do 2 more.
Yes. So it's like a 10, 23, and 22, 20 about my that's big and pain.
And graph them. We're gonna skip 3 and 4 and go on to 5 and 6. So we would need to solve this first. So how would I get this back in slope intercept form? Back to x. Divide everything by 2. You have y equals -1/2 x plus 4. When we divide, that becomes a fraction, not 2x. So if I were to graph this, it would start at +4. It's negative, so I can go up and left. Up 1, left 2, or down 1, right 2, as many times as possible. So the graph. compare this to the original. What changed? Okay, the slope and y-intercept changed. What changed about them? Y-intercept shifted up 4. So is it steeper? Because it's a fraction. So the slope is less steep. By 1/2. Did anything else happen?
Yeah.
Because of the negative. Questions on that one before we do number 6? Same process, get rid of the 7x by subtracting. So that y equals negative 7x plus 5. So when we graph that, it would only have 2 points. At 5, go down 7, and to the right 1. And then what changed? Intercept shifted up how much? 5. Anything else? Slope was reflected because it's negative. Now let's see. These are 2 different things. The negative is the reflected, the 7 deals with the steepness. So it's steeper. You have to remember that the negative and the number are 2 separate things. Questions on that one? Look on the back. Do we want to do either of those 2 together? So I will say be careful because the graph is counting by 2s, not by 1s. So for the remainder of class, I'm going to give you options. You can be working on the 4 problems we didn't do in this packet, these 2, and then the last 2. You could go back to your graphing notes and try practicing your transformations on your graphing while practicing your graphing. You can work on delta math. Remember that you have 4, 3, slope part 2, x, y, intercepts graphing. Delta math due on Friday, as well as the linear transformations practice. So you can be working on any of those. Or starting tomorrow, we're going to go over the review. So if you would like that to start working on, I can give you that as well. So if you want the review, come see me and I'll grab that for you. But be working on one of those things. The choice is yours as to what. You can work together on those. Use your notes, use your calculator, use Desmos. Use this time wisely.